My name is Farah Carolyn. I'm in my early 30s, and for most of my adult life, I have been described with words like steady, composed, and reliable. I work in a structured, analytical field where people often assume that the quietest person in the room is the least influential. I've learned to let them believe that. If you met me a few years ago, you probably would have placed me neatly into a category within the first 5 minutes. The responsible one, the practical one, the woman who makes sensible decisions and avoids unnecessary complications. I was the friend who double-checked the restaurant reservations, the colleague who finished reports before deadlines, the daughter who never made headlines at family gatherings. And when it came to dating, I was equally predictable. At least that's what everyone thought. There was a certain type of man I had quietly ruled out in my 20s. Not because he was cruel or dangerous, not because he was incapable, but because he didn't fit the blueprint I had carefully drawn for myself. I believed in alignment, shared ambition, similar backgrounds, compatible social circles. I believed in stability that looked impressive on paper. I also believed I was very good at reading people. This story begins with judgment, mine, because I married the man I once swore I'd never date, and the person I judged the most became my husband. What unfolded between those 2 points was not dramatic in the way movies portray transformation. There were no grand gestures in the rain, no public apologies, no explosive confrontations. Instead, it was a slow unraveling of certainty, a quiet education in humility, a series of small moments that forced me to confront the parts of myself I thought were strengths but were actually defenses. I won't tell you this story to glorify romance, and I won't tell it to punish the younger version of myself either. This is about perception, about the roles we assign to people without realizing it, about the subtle ways pride disguises itself as discernment, and about what happens when the person you underestimated sees you more clearly than you see yourself. There were misunderstandings. There were uncomfortable realizations. There were moments when my silence meant more than my words. And there was one pivotal shift that changed not only how I saw him, but how I saw myself. If you've ever dismissed someone too quickly, or if you've ever been the one dismissed, then maybe this story will feel familiar. Have you ever been completely certain about someone, only to discover later that you were wrong in the most unexpected way? Before I ever noticed him, people had already decided who I was. At work, I was dependable Farah, the one who would catch the overlooked clause in a contract, the one who stayed late without complaint. In meetings, I didn't interrupt. I waited. I spoke last, if at all. When I did, my sentences were short and final, like closing brackets. No one argued with me, but they didn't fully see me either. In Seattle's corporate world, especially in finance, personality becomes a currency. The charismatic consultant, the bold strategist, the networking extrovert who knows everyone's dog's name. I wasn't that. I didn't linger after meetings to exchange laughter in the hallway. I went back to my desk, removed my blazer, rolled up my sleeves, and did the work that made other people look polished. And I was good at it. But competence without spectacle is easy to overlook. Socially, I carried the same quiet reputation. Friends described me as intimidating at first, and surprisingly warm once you know her. I had learned to accept that duality. The truth was simpler. I didn't perform comfort. I offered it steadily, without theatrics. When it came to dating, I was methodical. I didn't chase chemistry. I evaluated compatibility, education, career trajectory, emotional maturity, financial literacy. I made lists in my head, even if I pretended not to. Stability mattered to me in ways I didn't always explain. Growing up, I had watched uncertainty seep into every room of our house. Bills whispered about at the kitchen table, sudden moves, my mother's careful budgeting. So I built a life that couldn't wobble, and I built standards that matched it. My friends joked that I interviewed men more than I dated them. They weren't entirely wrong. I asked questions that felt harmless but revealed everything. How do you handle conflict? What does ambition mean to you? Where do you see yourself in 5 years? I told myself I was protecting my future. The type of man I admired was predictable, polished, articulate, professionally driven, someone who walked into a room and fit seamlessly into my world. Someone who looked like he belonged next to me in photographs taken at charity galas or corporate retreats. And then there was him. At that time, he existed only on the outer edges of my social circle. A friend of a friend, the kind of person who lingered by the snack table at gatherings, not because he was awkward, but because he seemed uninterested in competing for attention. He didn't dress poorly. He just didn't dress to impress. No tailored suits, no careful branding of himself. His shirts were simple. His shoes are practical. He laughed easily, but not loudly. If I'm honest, I didn't dislike him. I simply categorized him. Not ambitious enough, too relaxed, probably unfocused. I had never spoken to him for more than 3 minutes, but I felt certain. That certainty came from something subtle. He didn't try to win the room. And in my mind, that meant he didn't have the drive to lead one. It's uncomfortable to admit how quickly I assessed him, how efficiently I dismissed him. He didn't fit my blueprint, so I never considered that perhaps my blueprint was flawed. To him, I imagine I looked composed, maybe distant, maybe unattainable. I rarely initiated conversation. When he offered casual comments in group discussions, I responded politely but briefly, as if conserving energy. I believed I was being neutral. In reality, I was reinforcing distance. There is a particular kind of invisibility that comes from being underestimated. I knew that feeling well in professional settings, but I never questioned whether I might be the one doing the underestimating in my personal life. Back then, if someone had told me that the man I barely noticed would one day be my husband, I would have smiled politely and changed the subject. Not because I thought I deserved better, but because I thought I knew better, and I was very, very sure of myself. The first time he unsettled me, it wasn't dramatic. There was no argument, no raised voices, no scene. It was a comment, casual, almost weightless. We were at a mutual friend's birthday dinner, the kind where the table is too long for everyone to hear each other clearly. Conversations broke into smaller islands. I was discussing a regulatory shift affecting financial compliance, something I had spent weeks analyzing. A few people nodded politely, though I could tell their interest was fading. He was seated across from me, quiet as usual. At some point, someone asked what he thought about the topic. I remember feeling mildly surprised. He didn't work in finance. Why ask him? He shrugged slightly and said, "I don't know much about the technical side, but it sounds like the real risk isn't the regulation, it's how companies respond emotionally to it." The table grew still for a second. He continued, not trying to dominate the space, just thinking aloud. When people feel pressured, they cut corners. Not because they're careless, because they're afraid. That's where mistakes usually happen. It was a simple observation, but it reframed the entire conversation. I felt something tighten in my chest, not anger, not embarrassment, something sharper, recognition. He wasn't competing with me. He wasn't correcting me. He had simply stepped outside the data and pointed to the human variable I hadn't mentioned. Everyone nodded thoughtfully. Someone said, "That actually makes sense." And I smiled. Of course I smiled. "That's true," I said evenly. "Behavioral response is a major factor." But inside I replayed his words. He hadn't spoken loudly. He hadn't tried to impress. And yet he had shifted the direction of the conversation in less than 30 seconds. The strange part wasn't that he was insightful. It was what I hadn't expected him to be. That was the first small cut. Not something he did to me. Something my own assumption exposed. Later that evening, while people gathered coats and exchanged goodbyes, he held the door open for me. Not performatively, just habit. "You explained that regulation thing clearly," he said. "Most people would have made it sound more complicated." There was no sarcasm in his voice, no flirtation, just a quiet acknowledgement. "Thank you," I replied. He nodded once and walked toward the parking lot. That was it. But I found myself thinking about it the next day. Not because I was flattered. I had received compliments before. It was the tone. the steadiness. He didn't seem intimidated by my expertise, and he didn't seem overly impressed either. He met it neutrally. I tried to dismiss the lingering discomfort. I told myself it was nothing. A single comment over dinner doesn't redefine a person. People surprise you sometimes. It doesn't mean you were wrong about them. Still, something had shifted, a hairline fracture in certainty. Over the next few weeks, I noticed him more, not intentionally, just reflexively. In group settings, he listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, it was precise, observational, often directed at the emotional undercurrents that everyone else ignored. He didn't chase attention, and yet he didn't disappear either. That unsettled me, because I had built my judgments on visible markers: ambition that announces itself, confidence that fills a room, drive that competes for dominance. He had none of that on the surface. Instead, he had something quieter, and I wasn't sure what to do with it. The first small cut wasn't humiliation. It wasn't rejection. It was the realization that I might have miscalculated someone who never tried to prove me wrong. And if I was wrong about him, what else was I certain about that needed re-examining? After that dinner, nothing dramatic happened. He didn't suddenly pursue me. I didn't suddenly soften. Our interactions remained polite, spaced out across birthdays, engagement parties, and the occasional group brunch. On the surface, everything stayed normal. But internally, something more subtle was unfolding. It began with small moments of dismissal, not from him, but from me. If he offered an opinion in a group setting, I would nod, then pivot the conversation back to something more substantial. If he made a joke, I smiled but rarely built on it. I told myself I was simply reserved, that I didn't owe anyone extended enthusiasm. But the truth was more uncomfortable. I was minimizing him. Not consciously, not maliciously, just instinctively. There's a kind of quiet hierarchy that forms in social groups. The achievers, the charismatic ones, the ones who are going places. I had always placed myself firmly within that upper tier, not because I was arrogant, but because I worked relentlessly to stay there. And he didn't seem to care about tiers at all. He worked in urban design for the city, a stable job, yes, but not flashy, not aggressively ambitious. He spoke about community spaces and accessibility with the same tone I used to discuss financial forecasts: calm, thoughtful, unrushed. I remember once interrupting him mid-sentence. It was unintentional. At least that's what I told myself. He was explaining a neighborhood redevelopment project, describing how small changes in layout could influence how safe people felt walking at night. I cut in with a comment about budget constraints and regulatory approvals, turning the conversation toward numbers again. He stopped speaking. Not abruptly, not offended, just stopped. Then he said, "That's fair. You're probably right," and let it go. The table moved on. But later that evening, the moment replayed in my mind. His tone hadn't carried resentment. It hadn't carried a submission either. It was neutral, almost generous. He had allowed me to redirect the conversation without resistance. At the time, I interpreted that as a lack of conviction. Now I see it differently. Over the following months, a pattern emerged. I would subtly assert intellectual dominance in conversations. He would step back. Not defeated, just uninterested in competing. And each time I rationalized my behavior. I'm just being analytical. I'm contributing. I'm clarifying the point. I told myself that if he truly disagreed, he would push back. The fact that he didn't meant he either agreed or didn't care enough. But one afternoon, during a smaller gathering at a coffee shop, something shifted. We were seated across from each other, waiting for the others to arrive. The conversation drifted to relationships. I mentioned casually that I preferred partners who were forward-thinking and strategically driven. He stirred his coffee slowly. "That makes sense," he said. "Stability feels safer when you've had instability." My hand paused midair. I hadn't told him much about my childhood, not directly. "What do you mean?" I asked, keeping my tone light. He looked at me, not intensely, not challengingly, just directly. People who grow up with uncertainty tend to overcorrect. They look for structure in everything, even in love. There was no accusation in his voice, no attempt to expose me, just observation. I felt something defensive rise in my chest. That's a bit reductive, I replied. Some people just value compatibility. He nodded. True, compatibility matters. And again, he let it go. No argument, no insistence. I left that cafe unsettled. Because he hadn't insulted me, he hadn't challenged me publicly, he hadn't embarrassed me. He had simply seen through me, and I didn't like that. Instead of confronting that discomfort, I normalized it. I told myself he was overanalyzing, that he was projecting, that I was justified in my preferences. I doubled down on my internal narrative. I knew what I wanted. I wasn't settling. I wasn't naive. But beneath that certainty was a quieter truth. I wasn't dismissing him because he lacked depth. I was dismissing him because his depth made me feel exposed. And exposure is a kind of vulnerability I had trained myself to avoid. So I kept him in his assigned role. Pleasant, insightful, not for me. And every time I chose that interpretation, it became easier to believe. Until it didn't. There's a moment in every social dynamic when you realize you've been cast. Not chosen, cast. It happened gradually for me, the way fog rolls into Seattle without announcement. One day, the skyline is sharp and defined, and the next, it's softened into something indistinct. You don't notice the shift until you try to see clearly and can't. In our friend group, I was the strategist. If someone was negotiating a salary, they called me. If a couple was buying a house, I reviewed their mortgage options. When a friend's startup idea needed financial modeling, I built the spreadsheet. I was the quiet consultant in the background, never the center of celebration, always the architect behind it. Reliable, useful, invisible. And with him, I was something else too. I was the evaluator, the one who raised an eyebrow when he talked about prioritizing community impact over private sector profit, the one who asked practical questions about scalability and long-term gains, the one who subtly implied that idealism had limits. He never pushed back. He would answer thoughtfully, sometimes even smiling as if he recognized what I was doing. Once, at a rooftop gathering, someone joked that he was too chill to survive corporate life. Laughter rippled around the group. I didn't laugh loudly, but I didn't interrupt either. He shrugged lightly. I prefer building things that last longer than quarterly reports. It was clever, calm, unbothered. And yet, I felt a strange secondhand discomfort, not for him, but for the role I had quietly reinforced. Because in that moment, I saw the contrast clearly. They saw him as relaxed, maybe even unambitious. They saw me as disciplined, sharp, and dependable. But what if those labels were incomplete? Later that evening, while most people clustered near the bar, he and I ended up near the edge of the rooftop, overlooking the water. The city lights flickered against the dark surface, reflections breaking and reforming with the tide. "You don't like inefficiency," he said casually, hands in his jacket pockets. "I don't," I replied. He nodded. "It's not just about efficiency, though." "What do you mean?" "You don't like unpredictability." It wasn't accusatory. It wasn't probing. It was observational. I felt the familiar instinct to defend, to redirect, to intellectualize the statement. But instead I asked, "And that's a flaw?" He tilted his head slightly. "Not a flaw, just a pattern." There it was again. He wasn't assigning me a negative trait. He was describing me without judgment. And I realized something uncomfortable. While I had quietly assigned him the role of pleasant but not aligned, he had never reduced me to a single dimension. He saw my precision, my guardedness, my discipline, and he didn't mock it. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing how others treated me in contrast. When plans needed organizing, they turned to me. When decisions needed clarity, they deferred to me. But when conversations turned emotional, messy, vulnerable, uncertain, they often drifted elsewhere. I was the anchor. But anchors don't move. Anchors hold. There's dignity in that, strength even. But there's also isolation. I began to wonder if I had built a persona so controlled, so competent, that people stopped imagining me as someone who needed softness, or who could offer it without analysis. And in that framework, he didn't fit beside me. Because he wasn't rigid, he wasn't image conscious, he didn't perform ambition in the way I had been taught to admire. He seemed at ease, and ease felt dangerous to someone who equated tension with preparedness. One afternoon, I caught myself describing him to a coworker who had met him briefly. "He's nice," I said, "very thoughtful, just not really driven in the conventional sense." The sentence lingered in the air. driven in the conventional sense. What did that even mean? I had assigned him a limitation based on my definition of success, and I had assigned myself a role based on others' expectations. The strategist, the stable one, the rational one. But roles are comfortable precisely because they prevent evolution. The realization wasn't explosive, it was quiet. I had placed him in a box, and in doing so, I had placed myself in one too. The difference was he seemed perfectly content outside of it. I wasn't so sure I was. The shift didn't happen at a party. It didn't happen during a debate or a moment of tension. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, under gray skies that Seattle wears like a uniform. I had taken the day off unexpectedly. A project at work had collapsed after weeks of preparation, budget approvals withdrawn at the last minute due to executive indecision. No one blamed me. In fact, I was praised for my resilience and professionalism. But I drove home feeling hollow. Resilience is a compliment people give you when they assume you won't break. That afternoon, I stopped by a small public park near Lake Union. It wasn't planned. I just didn't want to sit in my apartment with the silence pressing against the walls. And that's where I saw him. He was kneeling near a section of newly planted trees, speaking with an older man who looked like a community volunteer. There were rolled-up blueprints resting on a bench beside them. I hesitated, considering whether to approach or quietly leave. He noticed me first. A small lift of his hand, no surprise, no theatrics, just acknowledgement. I walked over. "I didn't know you worked out here," I said, gesturing vaguely toward the park. He brushed dirt from his palms. "We're redesigning the walking paths, improving lighting. It's part of a city initiative." There was no grand explanation, no attempt to impress me, just information. I glanced at the plans on the bench. Lines, angles, and subtle curves guide foot traffic. It looked deceptively simple. "Does it make that much difference?" I asked. "Changing a path?" He studied the drawing before answering. "People avoid spaces that feel uncertain," he said. "If you can see where you're going and you feel seen while walking, you're more likely to use it." The words landed heavier than they should have. If you can see where you're going and you feel seen while walking. I watched as a woman with a stroller navigated a cracked portion of pavement nearby. She adjusted awkwardly around a dimly lit corner. He followed my gaze. "That's the part we're fixing," he said quietly. There was something in his tone that felt different from our past conversations. It wasn't analytical. It wasn't detached. It carried care. Not the loud kind, the steady kind. I realized then that I had been measuring ambition by visibility, titles, salary trajectories, public recognition. But here he was, changing the physical experience of strangers who would never know his name. And he wasn't restless about it. He wasn't chasing something bigger. He was focused. We sat on the bench for a while, watching the lake ripple in the wind. I told him, almost absent-mindedly, about my project being cut. I expected him to offer strategic advice, to dissect corporate politics, to analyze what I could have done differently. Instead, he asked, The question startled me. "Of course it did," I said automatically. He looked at me gently. "No, I mean, did it matter to you personally?" I paused. In all my years of navigating career decisions, very few people had asked that. "It was efficient," I replied slowly. "It made sense." "That's not what I asked." The air felt different, not confrontational, just honest. I exhaled. "Yes," I admitted. "It mattered." He nodded once, as if that was enough. No solutions, no critique, just space. And that's when something inside me shifted, not toward him exactly, but away from my rigidity. For the first time, I saw the flaw in my evaluation system. I had been asking, does he fit my structure? Does he match my pace? Does he enhance my stability? I had never asked, does he see me clearly? Does he make me question myself in ways that help me grow? As the afternoon light dimmed, he stood and gathered the blueprints. "We're almost done here," he said. "You're welcome to walk the current path before we change it." There was something symbolic in that invitation. Walk the current path before we change it. I did. And for the first time, I wondered whether I had mistaken tension for strength and ease for weakness. Maybe the shift wasn't about him proving anything. Maybe it was about me finally being willing to see differently. After that afternoon in the park, I didn't announce any revelations. There was no dramatic confession to my friends, no sudden change in how I spoke to him. If anything, I became quieter. But it wasn't the same silence as before. Before, my silence had been structural, strategic, a way of maintaining control. I spoke when necessary, withheld when uncertain, and calculated when responding. Now my silence felt observational. I began watching him differently. At group dinners, I stopped redirecting conversations when he spoke. I let his thoughts unfold fully, even when they drifted into topics I would once have considered impractical. Urban accessibility, community psychology, long-term civic trust. And something surprising happened. People leaned in, not because he was loud, not because he demanded attention, but because he spoke without needing approval. There's a difference between confidence and competition. I had always been competitive in subtle ways, intellectually precise, quick to refine a point, careful not to leave gaps in my logic. He didn't seem concerned with gaps. He allowed room for complexity. I realized how often I filled the silence to prevent ambiguity. He allowed it. One evening, during a discussion about career progression, someone asked him if he planned to move up soon, into a higher-paying private firm. He shook his head lightly. Not right now. Why not? Another friend pressed. You could earn double. He smiled, but not defensively. Money isn't the only metric. There was a hint of impatience at the table, an assumption that he lacked drive. I waited. Old instinct would have nudged me to add commentary, perhaps to frame his decision in more conventional terms, to make it palatable. Instead, I said nothing, and I watched. He didn't justify himself further. He didn't argue. He simply let the silence settle until the conversation shifted. On the drive home that night, I examined my own reaction. I had spent years defending my ambition, explaining my choices, ensuring they aligned with visible success. He seemed uninterested in explanation. Was that security, or was it indifference? The difference mattered. A week later, we met alone for coffee, his suggestion casual, uncharged. We spoke about work, about the city's growth, and about our families. At one point, he asked, "Do you ever get tired?" The question was gentle. Of what? I deflected. Of holding everything together. There it was again, that quiet perception. I considered giving him a polished answer, something composed and self-sufficient. Instead, I surprised myself. Sometimes, I admitted. He nodded, not triumphant, not sympathetic in an exaggerated way, just present. Silence lingered between us. This time, I didn't rush to fill it. I let it stretch, testing whether it felt awkward or safe. It felt steady. In that stillness, I recognized something important. I didn't feel evaluated by him. I didn't feel measured against a standard. I didn't feel the need to prove competence. And that absence of pressure unsettled me more than criticism ever had. Because if I wasn't performing strength, who was I? Over the next few weeks, my restraint became deliberate. When friends made offhand comments about his relaxed nature, I didn't reinforce them. When someone implied he lacked long-term vision, I didn't nod in agreement. I didn't defend him either. I simply withheld participation in the narrative. Silence, when chosen intentionally, becomes power. Not the loud kind, the subtle kind. People began noticing small things. How often he and I ended up in conversation, how rarely I corrected him anymore, how my posture softened slightly when he spoke. One friend teased, "You've been quiet tonight, Farah." I smiled lightly. Just listening. And I was. Listening not only to him, but to myself. The version of me that needed everything to be structured, predictable, impressive. She was still there. But she was loosening her grip. I wasn't falling in love. Not yet. I was recalibrating. And recalibration is quite work. From the outside, nothing dramatic had changed. Inside, everything had begun to. Silence had stopped being a defense. It had become a choice. Recalibration doesn't look romantic. It looks like an observation, like patience, like restraint. From the outside, nothing about our dynamic seemed dramatic enough to comment on. We weren't publicly affectionate. We weren't inseparable. We weren't even officially dating yet. We were simply in proximity. But proximity, when intentional, becomes a form of preparation. I began asking different questions, not out loud but internally. What does he do when he's disappointed? How does he handle being overlooked? Does he withdraw or does he recalibrate? I watched carefully. One afternoon, I learned that a proposal he had worked on for months, an accessibility redesign for a public transit corridor, had been postponed indefinitely due to funding redistribution. It was significant work, detailed, community supported. I expected frustration, maybe bitterness. Instead, he shrugged when he told me. "It's not gone," he said, "just delayed." "Doesn't that bother you?" I asked. "Of course it does," he replied evenly, "but it's not about me." That answer lingered. In my world, setbacks were personal. They reflected performance, leverage, and strategy. I tracked them meticulously. I corrected them quickly. He absorbed them, not passively, but without ego. I began documenting, not literally, but mentally, the patterns I noticed. He remembered details people shared casually. He followed up weeks later. He never used information as leverage. He used it as care. He wasn't loud in his ambition, but he was relentless in consistency. I also noticed something else. He didn't chase validation. At a dinner party, when someone dismissed his work as nice but small scale, he didn't argue. He simply asked a question back. "What scale matters to you?" The person stumbled. The conversation shifted. He never tried to dominate the narrative. He just reframed it. And slowly I began to see the architecture of his strength. It wasn't performative. It wasn't competitive. It was foundational. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had built my life around minimizing risk, around choosing stability over uncertainty, around aligning myself with men who projected upward trajectories. But I had never considered emotional stability as the primary metric. I started testing myself in subtle ways. When he spoke about choosing long-term community impact over a higher salary, I didn't instinctively calculate opportunity cost. I listened. When he admitted that sometimes he questioned whether his slower path would be misunderstood, I resisted the urge to optimize his thinking. I asked, "Does it still feel right to you?" "Yes," he said without hesitation. That certainty, quiet and unadorned, felt different from the polished confidence I was used to seeing. At work, I had begun noticing how often ambition was fueled by fear. Promotions are pursued to outrun insecurity. Salaries negotiated to silence doubt. With him, I didn't sense fear. I sensed alignment. And alignment is difficult to fake. Our conversations deepened gradually. We spoke about childhood memories, about our mothers, about the subtle anxieties we carried into adulthood. He told me he had once been underestimated academically because he was quiet in class. Teachers mistook his silence for disengagement. I felt a flicker of recognition. I used to over-prepare, I admitted, so no one could question me. He looked at me thoughtfully. That must have been exhausting. No one had ever framed my competence that way. Exhausting. It was. The friend group never noticed the shift in detail. They saw us talking more, yes. They saw occasional shared rides home. But they didn't see the recalibration happening beneath the surface. They didn't see me revising my evaluation system. They didn't see him refusing to chase approval. They didn't see the quiet exchange of vulnerability happening in small, controlled doses. Preparation doesn't require grand declarations. It requires attention, and I was paying attention in a way I never had before. Not to confirm my assumptions, but to dismantle them. The most humbling realization came late one night after a long conversation on my apartment balcony. We had been discussing fear, specifically my fear of instability. He listened without interruption. Then he said softly, "You don't have to hold everything alone." It wasn't possessive, it wasn't romanticized. It was practical. And in that moment, I understood something I hadn't allowed myself to see. The man I had judged as lacking drive was, in reality, the most emotionally disciplined person I knew. He wasn't competing for dominance. He already possessed it, quietly. And I was only just beginning to recognize it. The realization didn't arrive with fireworks. It arrived with numbers. One evening, we were sitting at my kitchen table. I had spreadsheets open. Habit, not necessity. We had been talking about long-term plans in the abstract, housing, savings, lifestyle preferences, not as a couple negotiating logistics, but as two adults comparing philosophies. I asked him a question I thought would confirm my old assumptions. If you ever wanted to pivot careers, move into the private sector, would you be financially prepared? It wasn't accusatory, just analytical. He looked at me calmly. Yeah. I waited for elaboration. He didn't offer it. Do you have investments? I pressed slightly. He nodded once. A few. There was no boastfulness in his tone, no defensive explanation. Something about his steadiness made me curious instead of skeptical. Can I ask how you structure them? I said, careful to keep my voice neutral. He considered for a moment, then reached into his bag and pulled out a slim folder. Not dramatically, not as if unveiling proof, just as if retrieving a receipt. Inside were organized summaries, long-term municipal bonds, low-cost index funds, strategic real estate investments, 2 modest rental properties purchased years earlier in neighborhoods he had helped redesign. I blinked. You own property? I asked, genuinely surprised. He nodded. Small ones, nothing flashy. The numbers were conservative but impressive. More importantly, they were intentional. Each purchase aligned with urban development patterns he had anticipated years before. He had invested not for rapid growth, but for stability and long-term appreciation. It was strategic. Quietly strategic. You never mentioned this, I said slowly. You never asked, he replied, not defensively, simply factually. There it was. The private reveal wasn't about wealth. It wasn't about proving he earned enough to qualify. It was about something deeper. He had been planning all along, not loudly, not competitively, but deliberately. And I had mistaken his lack of self-promotion for lack of ambition. I felt a flush of humility rise in my chest. All those times I had mentally calculated compatibility based on projected income curves and visible drive. I had never considered that someone could build leverage silently. He watched my reaction carefully, not to gauge approval, but to understand what I was processing. I don't talk about it much, he said. Money gets strange when it becomes identity. That sentence stayed with me. Money gets strange when it becomes identity. In my world, income was often shorthand for worth. Promotions signaled value. Growth was measured in upward charts. He treated finances like infrastructure, necessary, important, but not performative. I realized something else in that moment. He hadn't revealed this earlier because he didn't need to. He wasn't trying to win me over. He wasn't trying to shift my perception. He had been comfortable being underestimated. That level of internal security unsettled me more than any display of dominance could have, because it meant he didn't require validation from me. The leverage I discovered wasn't just financial. It was psychological. He knew who he was. He knew what he valued. And he had structured his life accordingly, without broadcasting it. I closed the folder gently. I misjudged you, I said quietly. He studied me for a second. Maybe, he replied. Or maybe you just didn't have the full picture. There was no edge in his voice, no triumph, just clarity. I sat back in my chair, the silver watch on my wrist catching the kitchen light. For years I had equated control with strength. I had believed that the most powerful position in any dynamic was the one who evaluates, who decides, who approves. But sitting across from him, I understood something humbling. The person who doesn't need to prove anything often holds more power than the one who does. The reveal didn't make me fall in love instantly. It made me reassess everything. Not because he was secretly more successful than I thought, but because he had never needed me to know. And that quiet confidence, unadvertised, unbothered, shifted the balance of how I saw him. For the first time, I wasn't measuring whether he fit into my life structure. I was asking whether my structure had been too narrow to recognize his. After that night at my kitchen table, the dynamic between us changed. Subtly, but permanently. Not because he had proven something, but because I had lost the illusion of superior evaluation. For years, I had believed I was the one assessing compatibility, the one determining viability, the quiet gatekeeper of my future. But now, sitting alone with my thoughts, I understood something difficult. He had never auditioned. He had simply existed, fully formed, internally aligned, uninterested in convincing me. And that realization placed me at a crossroads. There were multiple paths available to me. The first was the easiest: retreat. I could reframe the revelation as irrelevant, tell myself that financial stability wasn't the primary issue, that lifestyle differences still mattered, that alignment required more than quiet strength. I could preserve my ego by reasserting my original blueprint. The second path was cautious proximity. Continue spending time together. Keep the connection undefined. Allow ambiguity to protect me from risk. That option felt safe, emotionally hedged, strategically reversible. And then there was the third option, the irreversible one. To admit to myself first that I had been wrong, not just about him, but about what I thought I needed. Admitting that would require more than shifting affection. It would require dismantling an identity I had curated for over a decade. The woman who chose carefully, the woman who calculated compatibility, the woman who never misread character. There is something deeply destabilizing about recognizing your own blind spot, especially when you pride yourself on discernment. Over the next few weeks, I tested my own clarity. When he didn't text for a day, I observed my reaction. It wasn't anxiety, it was curiosity. When we disagreed on a minor issue about travel preferences, I watched how he handled tension, calmly, directly, no withdrawal, no escalation. He didn't punish silence, he didn't weaponize distance. He addressed things, and I realized something quietly profound. I felt safe disagreeing with him. That had not always been true in my past relationships. With men who matched my previous blueprint, polished, assertive, upwardly mobile, disagreements often felt like negotiations for dominance, subtle, refined, but present. With him, disagreement felt collaborative. One evening, we walked along the water after dinner. The city lights reflected in uneven streaks across the surface. I knew the moment had arrived, not because he demanded clarity, but because ambiguity no longer felt honest. "I need to tell you something," I said. He stopped walking, giving me his full attention. "I misjudged you," I began. "Not in a small way, in a structural way." He didn't interrupt. "I built a version of you in my head based on very limited data," I continued, "and I was confident in it." "And now?" he asked softly. "Now I realized that my confidence wasn't accurate, it was protection." The air between us felt still but not tense. "I'm not interested in keeping things undefined anymore," I said carefully. "If we continue this, I want it to be intentional." There it was, the irreversible step. Not dramatic, not performative, just clear. He studied me for a long second, not evaluating, not triumphant, just thoughtful. "I've been intentional," he replied evenly. "I was waiting for you to decide if you wanted to be." There was no accusation in that statement, only truth. And in that moment, I understood the quiet dominance I had been circling for months. He had never chased me, never competed, never tried to dismantle my assumptions. He had simply held his ground and allowed me the space to arrive at my own realization. "I do," I said. It wasn't a confession of love. It was a decision to stop optimizing compatibility through fear, a decision to choose alignment over image, a decision to step into something that couldn't be easily reversed. We resumed walking, not hand in hand at first, but side by side. The path ahead wasn't guaranteed. It wasn't perfectly mapped. But for the first time in a long time, I wasn't choosing based on control. I was choosing based on clarity. And clarity, I had learned, doesn't shout. It settles. Once the decision was made, I expected something external to shift. It didn't. There was no announcement to our friends, no social media declaration, no performative transition from ambiguity to official status. We simply began operating differently. Intentionality is quiet work. We started with conversations most couples delay, values, boundaries, financial philosophies, and family expectations. Not because we were rushing toward marriage, but because neither of us believed in drifting. One Saturday morning, we sat at my dining table again. This time, there were no surprises, just transparency. We compared savings goals, retirement projections, long-term living preferences, children, yes or no, and under what conditions. Geographic flexibility, aging parents. There was no tension in the discussion, just precision. I noticed something subtle. He didn't attempt to merge our plans immediately. He asked questions first. "If we disagree," he said at one point, "which principle matters more to you, security or autonomy?" The question was surgical. "Security," I answered without hesitation. He nodded. "For me, autonomy." We sat with that. Old versions of me might have treated that as incompatibility, a red flag to dissect, a misalignment to optimize. Instead, we examined the intersection. Security doesn't require control. Autonomy doesn't require detachment. We began designing a structure that honored both joint investments, but separate discretionary funds, a shared emergency reserve built conservatively, long term housing in a stable neighborhood, but flexibility and career mobility. Nothing dramatic, just architecture. Our friends noticed small changes. We arrived together more often. We left the gatherings at the same time. The teasing began, light, curious. Did I miss something? One friend asked with a grin. I smiled. No, we just stopped pretending. They assumed it had been building all along. They were right, but they hadn't seen the recalibration. At work, I noticed something shifting in me as well. I stopped over-explaining my decisions. I stopped defending every strategic move, not because I cared less, but because I no longer felt solely responsible for stability. The weight I had carried privately for years began to redistribute. He didn't demand space in my life. He earned it through steadiness. One evening, after reviewing a potential property listing together, he said casually, "We don't have to rush anything." It struck me how different that tone was from men I had dated before, men who measured progress in visible milestones. He wasn't accelerating, he was aligning. There's a particular kind of strength in moving without spectacle. We informed our closest friends quietly. No group announcement, just individual conversations. I didn't expect that, one friend admitted. You always seemed different. I replied, until I wasn't. There was no defensiveness in my tone, just truth. The most strategic action we took wasn't financial or logistical. It was emotional. We agreed on one principle early. No public performance of conflict. If there was tension, we handled it privately, calmly, without escalation. And there was tension, of course. Differences in pace, differences in expression. My instinct is to overstructure, his instinct to pause. But each disagreement became data, not ammunition. No one outside our conversations knew when we recalibrated. They only saw steadiness. Months passed before the word marriage entered the conversation directly. And when it did, it wasn't framed as a leap. It was framed as a continuation. If we're already building this, he said one evening, why keep pretending it's temporary? There was no ring presented in candlelight, no orchestrated surprise, just clarity. I didn't feel swept. I felt grounded. The woman who once swore she would never date someone like him was now reviewing prenup clauses, not out of distrust, but out of shared respect for structure. We signed documents quietly. We planned a small ceremony. No spectacle, no extravagance. When people eventually heard the news, the reaction was unanimous surprise. I never saw that coming. I did, eventually. And the most powerful part wasn't the decision itself. It was how quietly we made it. No chasing, no convincing, no proving. Just two people choosing deliberately. And in that silence, something undeniable had formed. When people think of consequences, they imagine fallout, arguments, broken friendships, dramatic revelations. That wasn't our experience. The consequences of our decision arrived quietly, through shifts in behavior, through subtle recalibrations in how others related to us. The first sign was confusion. At a dinner gathering, someone casually asked how long we had been official. The tone was light, but the curiosity was real. When we answered calmly, months later, there was a brief pause. Months? Another friend repeated. You never said anything. We didn't think it required an announcement, I replied. That response unsettled them more than I expected. In our social circle, transitions were usually narrated publicly. Soft launches on social media, carefully timed introductions, relationship milestones framed like achievements. We had bypassed that stage entirely, and in doing so, we had unintentionally disrupted an unspoken script. Some friends began reassessing their own assumptions. A few admitted privately that they had never imagined him with someone like me. I just thought you'd choose someone more intense, one friend confessed gently. I smiled. I did. But intensity, I had learned, doesn't always look loud. The more noticeable shift, however, was in how people treated him. Before, when he expressed opinions in group discussions, there had been a subtle tone of indulgence, polite listening, occasional teasing. Now there was attentiveness. Not because he had changed, but because my visible alignment with him altered their perception. It was uncomfortable to realize how much social value is assigned through association. One evening, a mutual acquaintance approached him to ask for advice about a property investment. The same person who once dismissed his work as sloth. He answered thoughtfully, without reference to past remarks. No correction, no subtle revenge, just consistency. I watched that interaction carefully. This was the quiet dominance I had underestimated. He didn't adjust his demeanor when his perceived status rose. He remained the same. At work, consequences appeared differently. Colleagues who had always seen me as singularly career-focused began asking cautious questions about whether I planned to scale back. It wasn't accusatory, it was habitual. Marriage, in certain professional circles, still triggers assumptions, especially for women. I answered clearly, no, we're scaling intentionally, not reducing. The phrasing mattered. I felt less defensive than I might have years earlier because the partnership didn't threaten my ambition. It stabilized it. The most surprising consequence, however, was internal. Without realizing it, I had built part of my identity around independence as armor. The capable woman who needed no emotional reinforcement. Now leaning into partnership required subtle humility, not dependence, interdependence, and that shift revealed something I hadn't anticipated. People are often more comfortable with your predictability than your growth. A close friend pulled me aside one afternoon. "You seem different," she said carefully. "Different how?" "Calmer, less sharp." The comment wasn't an insult, but it revealed how I had been perceived. Sharpness had been my edge. Control had been my language. I considered her observation thoughtfully. "Maybe I don't need to be sharp all the time," I said. She nodded slowly, processing. Some friendships adjusted seamlessly, others required time. When you redefine yourself quietly, people must recalibrate their expectations without a script. But there was no hostility, no dramatic backlash, just subtle reorganization. The most important consequence, though, was something only I could measure. I no longer evaluated him against an imagined alternative. I no longer ran internal comparisons with men who matched my old blueprint. The comparison system had dissolved. In its place was something steadier. Choice. And choice, once conscious, reshapes everything. We hadn't staged a public declaration. We hadn't demanded acknowledgement. But our quiet alignment shifted the room regardless. Not through dominance, through consistency. And that consistency began revealing who was willing to adjust and who preferred the older version of me. Consequences don't always explode. Sometimes they simply rearrange the landscape. And I was beginning to understand that rearrangement is necessary for permanence. The panic didn't come from us. It came from others. Not loud panic, not dramatic confrontations, just a subtle tightening in certain conversations once our wedding date became official. We had chosen something small, intimate, intentional. A quiet ceremony with close friends and family. No spectacle, no grand venue. When the invitations were sent, reality settled in for people who had always viewed us as an unlikely pairing. One acquaintance, someone who had once flirted casually with him at group gatherings, approached me with forced brightness. "I always thought you'd end up with someone more corporate," she said, laughing lightly. "You surprised us." There it was again, the old blueprint. I didn't respond defensively. "I surprised myself," I replied calmly. The truth disarmed her more than any sharp remark could have. Another friend who had dated men similar to my previous preferences asked quietly, "Are you sure this isn't just comfort?" The question wasn't malicious. It carried genuine curiosity and maybe a touch of projection. I considered it carefully before answering. "Comfort without respect fades," I said. "This isn't that." What people struggled with wasn't our compatibility. It was the narrative shift. For years, I had embodied a specific trajectory. Upward mobility, strategic partnerships, visible alignment. My dating history reinforced that expectation. Then I chose differently. And when someone deviates from their established pattern, observers instinctively search for error. Had I settled? Was I compromising ambition? Was I softening too much? What they didn't see was the internal audit I had already completed. The doubt phase was over. The recalibration was complete. There was nothing left to fix. One evening, a former colleague, someone I had briefly dated years earlier, sent a congratulatory message. Polite, measured. "I didn't expect that," he wrote, "but I hope he knows how driven you are." The subtext was clear. Driven women require equally driven men by a specific definition. I showed the message to my fiancé not for validation, but out of transparency. He read it once, then handed the phone back. He probably means well, he said. No irritation, no insecurity, just steadiness. That response mattered more than any rebuttal. There were small ripples in my professional sphere as well. An executive I work closely with asked during a performance review, "Are you anticipating any lifestyle changes that might affect long-term availability?" I understood the coded language. "No," I answered clearly. "If anything, I have more stability now." The conversation moved on, but I recognized something important in that moment. People often assume they can recalibrate their choices through doubt, that if they introduce just enough uncertainty, you'll revisit your decision. But here's what they didn't understand. I had already done the hard work privately. I had already questioned my motives, already examined my fears, already dismantled my old blueprint. Their concerns were months late, and when doubt arrives late, it loses power. There was one final moment that crystallized everything. A week before the wedding, we attended a small gathering. Someone, perhaps emboldened by wine, asked him directly, "Do you ever feel like you're marrying up?" The table went quiet. It was framed as a joke. It wasn't. He didn't flinch. "I don't think of people in vertical terms," he replied evenly. "But I'm very aware of how fortunate I am." Then he looked at me, not to claim ownership, not to assert dominance, just acknowledgement. There was no defensiveness in his tone, and something about that calm dismantled the hierarchy embedded in the question. No one pushed further, because the premise itself had dissolved. Later that night, I reflected on how easily I could have internalized those doubts years earlier, how quickly I once categorized him, how certain I had been. Now, watching others attempt to recalibrate a decision that was already settled, I understood something fundamental. When clarity is internal, external noise becomes background. There was nothing to fix, not perception, not narrative, not compatible. The woman who once swore she'd never date someone like him had already done her revision. And the person I judged the most was about to become my husband. Too late to reconsider, too late to rewrite, exactly on time to understand. The confrontation I remember most didn't happen at our wedding. It happened 2 weeks before. It wasn't loud. It wasn't public. It didn't involve shouting or ultimatums. It happened in my parents' living room. My mother had always trusted my judgment. She admired my discipline, my independence. But as we sat together reviewing final details for the ceremony, she grew unusually quiet. "You're certain?" she asked finally. The question was gentle. "Yes," I replied. She folded her hands in her lap. "He's very kind." There was something unfinished in her tone. "But," I prompted. She hesitated. "You've always aimed high, Farah. I just want to make sure you're not choosing peace over potential." The phrasing was careful. Peace over potential. For a moment, I felt the old reflex rise, the instinct to defend, to present evidence, to outline his investments, his strategy, his foresight. But I didn't. Because this wasn't about numbers. It was about perception. "I used to think potential looked a certain way," I said calmly. "Titles, pace, visibility." She listened. "And now?" she asked. "Now I think potential is consistency over time." There was no frustration in my voice, no irritation at her concern, just clarity. She studied my face as if searching for hesitation. "I don't feel smaller with him," I continued. "I feel steadier." That seemed to settle something in her. Later that week, a different kind of confrontation emerged, this time from an old friend. We met for coffee, and after a few minutes of surface conversation, she leaned forward. "You know I love you," she said. "I know. I just don't want you to disappear into someone else's rhythm." There it was again. The assumption that choosing a calmer dynamic meant shrinking. "I'm not disappearing," I replied evenly. "I'm adjusting." "To what?" "To something that doesn't require performance." The word lingered between us. Performance. For years, I had performed strength, performed control, performed strategic perfection. And she had admired that version of me. "You were so sharp before," she said quietly. "I was sharp because I thought I had to be." There was no resentment in my tone, no accusation toward her, just honesty. She sat back slowly. "I guess I just don't recognize this version yet," she admitted. "That's fair," I said. Confrontation doesn't have to burn to be real. Sometimes it's simply two people adjusting to a new equilibrium. The final moment of tension came unexpectedly from him. We were reviewing final wedding logistics when he paused mid-sentence. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Of course. If at any point you feel like you're choosing this because it feels safe rather than right, I need you to tell me." His voice was calm but serious. I understood the weight of that question. He wasn't asking for reassurance. He was asking for integrity. "I'm not choosing you because it's safe," I said carefully. "I'm choosing you because I trust you." He held my gaze for a long second, searching, not for weakness, but for alignment. "And you?" I asked quietly. "I'm choosing you because you challenge me," he said. "Not because you validate me." There it was. No fantasy, no dependency. Mutual clarity. Every confrontation leading up to our wedding had been quiet. No slammed doors, no emotional ultimatums, no theatrical declarations. Just measured questions, thoughtful answers. And each time I noticed something important. The old version of me would have treated doubt as something to defeat. The current version treated it as something to examine, without heat, without ego. Because when a decision is rooted in clarity rather than impulse, confrontation becomes confirmation, not threat. And by the time I walked down that aisle, there was nothing left to argue. Not with my mother, not with my friends, not with him, not even with myself. Marriage didn't transform me overnight. There was no sudden personality shift, no dramatic softening into a different woman. But something fundamental recalibrated. I no longer experienced life as something I must manage alone. That might sound simple. It isn't. For most of my adulthood, I equated competence with isolation. If I could anticipate every risk, structure every decision, optimize every outcome, then I wouldn't need to depend on anyone. Dependence felt dangerous. Now, years into this partnership, I understand the distinction I once missed. Dependence weakens autonomy. Interdependence strengthens it. I still work in corporate risk analysis. I still review contracts with precision. I still ask difficult questions in boardrooms where confidence is currency. But I no longer use sharpness as armor. I use it as a tool. At home, conversations aren't negotiations for dominance. They're calibrations. We disagree sometimes about pacing, about priorities, but the foundation never feels threatened. Because neither of us is competing for superiority. The woman I used to be measured potential through visibility, income trajectory, social alignment. The woman I am now measures potential through consistency, emotional regulation, long-term integrity. When people ask how we work, how two seemingly different temperaments align, I answer honestly. We were never as different as they assumed. We were simply quiet in different ways. I used to think quiet meant passive. Now I understand that quiet can be sovereign. There are moments when I look at him, reviewing blueprints at our dining table, adjusting lighting plans for a neighborhood park, and I feel something deeper than admiration. I feel respect, not because he proved me wrong, but because he never tried to. The man I once swore I would never date did not chase me into clarity. He stood still long enough for me to find it. And that has changed how I see everything, including myself. I am no longer the woman who leads with evaluation. I am the woman who leads with discernment. There is a difference. Evaluation seeks flaws. Discernment seeks truth. I don't regret the younger version of me. She built a structure when she needed protection. She chose ambition when she feared instability. But she was incomplete. And the person I judged the most became my husband, not because I lowered my standards, but because I raised them higher than titles, higher than optics, higher than projected growth curves. I raised them to include emotional steadiness, to include humility, to include the courage to revise my own certainty. If you met me today, you might still describe me as composed, strategic, reliable. But you would also notice something else: ease. Not because life is predictable, but because I no longer confuse control with strength. I married the man I once swore I'd never date, and in doing so, I became someone I hadn't yet imagined. Not softer, not smaller, just clearer. There's a version of this story that could have been dramatic. I could have framed myself as prideful and him as secretly superior. I could have exaggerated tension, sharpened conflict, and created villains out of well-meaning friends. But that wouldn't be honest. The truth is quieter. I married the man I once swore I'd never date, not because he transformed into someone else, but because I finally allowed myself to see him without the filter of fear. And the person I judged the most became my husband because he never argued his worth. He lived it. If there is a lesson here, it isn't ignore your standards, and it isn't opposites attract. It's this. Be careful when your preferences are built from protection rather than clarity. Sometimes what you call type is just familiarity. Sometimes what you call chemistry is just adrenaline. Sometimes what you call ambition is just noise. And sometimes the person you dismiss quietly holds the exact steadiness you claim to want. Judgment feels powerful because it creates certainty. But certainty, when unexamined, can become a cage. The strongest decision I made wasn't choosing him. I was questioning myself. It was admitting I had mistaken performance for alignment. It was allowing humility to revise my blueprint. We don't talk enough about that kind of growth. The kind that doesn't explode publicly, doesn't humiliate anyone, doesn't require revenge or spectacle. Just revision. If you've ever written someone off too quickly, or if you've ever been the person underestimated, I hope this story reminds you that quiet strength rarely announces itself. It waits. So I want to leave you with one question. Have you ever mistaken someone's calm for lack of depth, and what changed when you looked again? I'd love to hear your perspective in the comments.
Video hữu ích, hãy ấn like và đăng ký kênh để ủng hộ mình nhé. Chúng ta sẽ gặp nhau ở những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.